Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the NFL USA Today NFL Wire site that covers the Arizona Cardinals. In episode 493, this is our one bye-week edition with Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals sites, and one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast. We have in this episode, we're talking about the Cardinals win over the Pittsburgh Steelers. But like I said, this will be our one show this week. We've got no games to preview, and so we will be on bye like the team, come back, do a normal, what would be normally be a review show, but we'll do a couple other post-bye type things, and then go back into the preview segment. I'm sure Seth and I will do our preview show about the 49ers. I'm sure I can probably get Kyle Madsen back on for a third time this year to talk Cardinals 49ers, but what we do get to talk about, shock the world, the Cardinals beat the Pittsburgh Steelers 24-10 on the road. Their first road win. I've written this probably like 5 different stories because it's a cool thing. So it's their first road win of the season. It's their first road win since week 10 of last season. It was their first win over the Steelers since 2007. And it was their first win in Pittsburgh since 1969. Now, Seth is, despite his millions of kids, is pretty young. I'm much older, and 1969 even predates me by nearly 10 years. So in my lifetime, the Cardinals had never won in Pittsburgh. So we actually saw something pretty historic, and that's what we're here to talk about. So what I wanted to ask first, Seth, is this. Did the win say more about the Cardinals or more about the Steelers?
Yeah, I mean, it did, right? It's one of those situations where I don't know what the answer is, just because we knew the warts of the Steelers, right? You and I previewed the show last Thursday. We wondered aloud how that team was 7-4. We were curious what they could do. And you brought up a great point off the air. The reality is that the way that they win is unsustainable. And what we mean by that is they're a very, very good team at forcing turnovers and keeping the opponents from scoring, which is, a very key aspect of winning football games. However, they have not been good offensively for most of the year. And defensively, they're not the Steelers you're used to. They're middle of the pack, lower middle of the pack in terms of yardage allowed. They are middle of the pack against the run. And those things are not very Steelerish or what we have known the Steelers to be, especially under Mike Tomlin. And so their points per game or points against was kind of fluky, right? Like they do a good job in the red zone. They're not bad in the red zone by any means, but they don't really stop teams really well between the 20s, and they live and die by the turnover. And we highlighted it before the game. Their losses this season have really been when they don't force turnovers, because defensively, that's kind of how they live. And when you live and die by the sword, or in this case, turnovers, and you don't force any, which is kind of amazing in the weather, right? That the Cardinals ended up playing in.
Well,
when you don't force any turnovers, you even against what many consider a bad Arizona Cardinals team, it's hard to win a football game.
Yeah, it's absolutely the case, and there were some misfortune by the Steelers on their side of the ball as well, because they'd been relatively healthy. They didn't have Montravius Adams, but he hadn't played in a few weeks. They got Minkah Fitzpatrick back, but they lost Kenny Pickett. They lost their left guard Isaac Seumalo. T.J. Watt was injured for much of the second half. He came on and off the field, but he was not nearly as impactful as he could have been. Landon Roberts got hurt, and so they suffered an injury in the game to their starting quarterback to their top pass rusher, their best defensive player, their defensive signal caller in Landon Roberts, and one of their starting offensive linemen. And so,
well, and it was interesting. I was listening to a podcast, and the guy just happens to be a Steelers fan. It wasn't a Steelers-based podcast. And he was talking about, one of the things that has impressed him with Jonathan Gannon is that the guys play hard. Obviously, we had some questions about that last
against
week
the Rams. So the idea, I think we can now say they weren't tanking. They weren't tanking.
Yeah,
so
they just played really bad. But you look at it, and he was highlighting the fact that this game really swung not on the Pickett injury, but on the Landon Roberts injury. And as soon as that happened, the Cardinals, whether it's Gannon, Drew Petzing, but they started being able to run the ball, but they just ate the Steelers alive over the middle of the field with Trey McBride. And you saw that come out all of a sudden. And Landon Roberts left, and they were able to go down and score right before the half. And, that seemed like such an important point of the game, because obviously, it gave the Cardinals the 10-3 lead at the half. And then, there were a couple, questionable calls and for them to come back and get the ball or get the touchdown to McBride and win in that way, or get, ahead in that way, it was a huge deal, right? And then they come out and they've got some issues right off the gate, and you do get worried, right? Again, you're like, oh, here comes that second half lull, and you looked at it, and you had the pass by Murray that was knocked down by Watt, and then you gain 6 yards, and you're like, okay, just run the ball again, and they throw the ball, and it was one of the more frustrating plays of the game, because Kyler Murray literally hit Marquise Brown in the hand.
Oh, jeez.
And it didn't get caught. And you're like, okay. And, the Steelers come back out, and they've already missed a field goal in the game, and the weather's awful. I mean, there's no doubt about it, right? Like, the weather was a huge factor in the game, but the Cardinals had to play in it just as much as the Steelers did, and they obviously Pickett's out at this time, and they go for it on fourth, they're driving, and they're not really doing anything, right? And Trubisky drops the snap, Mason Cole strikes again, right? But this time on a different team. Dante Stills recovers it, and the Cardinals have the ball at the Pittsburgh 21, and it was almost easy, and you saw them kind of again take advantage, and
well, that's the thing, they took advantage. So what we saw earlier in the year in a couple of games where they got takeaways and then they couldn't do anything with them because they struggled offensively, on the turnover on downs and on the turnover, they turned those into 2 touchdowns, and that put the game away. Because they went from being, it was a 3 game, they were up 10-3, and then after that turnover, when they had the 21-yard, the 21-yard drive, 17-3, and after that, like even against a Cardinals defense, when you have Mitch Trubisky playing quarterback for the Steelers on an offense that already is not good, felt really good after that, because even with the Cardinals, defensively, the Steelers kind of went down the field and that was kind of easy, because their offense is so muddled. The Cardinals didn't, they like this with the Rams game. That's where seeing steamrolled is because they didn't get one stop, and then they couldn't get another stop, and then they scored again. The Steelers don't have that type of offense, and so even with early missteps offensively, they were able to find their stride and then got better and better. And my favorite thing was, and it probably was simply because of game situation, is that they were able to, and Petzing relied on James Conner. They kept going him, and it wasn't until the fourth, like, he had a very inefficient game until the fourth quarter.
Yeah, and there were some missed opportunities. We had a deep ball early in the game from Kyler to Rondell Moore that was just a flat out drop,
Yeah.
and then in the fourth quarter, you had a touchdown that was nullified on a very
terrible. Oh my gosh. That holding call. Okay, like if you like Diego, my son, came back, showed it to me a few times. So you could see, yeah, it was by definition a hold, but it happened nowhere near where Kyler was. So now the stupid offensive lineman, you're the guy you were blocking was nowhere near the play. So why? But and then we have to say this. As much as we liked Patrick Peterson during his time here, it's really easy to root against him as a Cardinals fan because of how he has talked about the Cardinals and the way he talks himself up. Oh, two different things. So that play when Connor literally stiff arms him like a rag doll out of bounds on one run, and to have Rondell Moore totally beat him in the end zone for the non-touchdown was good to see from a Cardinals fan. Yeah, we want to see Patrick eventually in the league, in the Ring of Honor and all that fun stuff. But in the meantime, since he apparently has a bone to pick with the organization still, hey Pat, I know you're not listening to this show, but how'd that feel? How'd that feel get it tossed by James Conner?
Right, and it's just one of those situations where they did a great job, taking advantage of those, like you said, those mistakes by the Steelers. They didn't make any mistakes, and it was interesting because some of the biggest mistakes were by like their biggest players. I mean, Miles Killebrew is just a special teams ace, but like he's a very, very good special teams player, and he had 3 major penalties for the Steelers, and like it's crazy to think that a guy like that who's been so good in Pittsburgh as a special teams guy could negatively impact the game for the Steelers, because he's a guy that is truly one of the better special teams guys in the NFL. And he was, 3 penalties, but his last one setting up the final touchdown drive, where they're backed up at the 9. Presley Harvin gets off a decent punt. Greg Dortch only gets a 7-yard return, but a 15-yard penalty takes it. So instead of being at the 48, the Cardinals get the ball at the 33. So, 2 of their scoring drives totaled 54 yards, but again, you can't do anything about that. Like you, as the team that's typically giving the other team a short field, it was great to see them take advantage of it and, to come back. And then I thought, one of the most impressive drives of the game was they got the ball back with 4:25 and they had to end things, and they just leaned on James Conner, and he
that was so
sure as hell ended them.
That was fantastic. It was, some interesting facts is that the Cardinals on the road previous to their game in Pittsburgh had not scored more than 16 points in any road game. They did that twice. They did that in Washington. They did that in San Francisco. And they had averaged 11.2 points a game on the road. They scored 24. And they did it by not reaching 300 yards. So the offensive numbers for the Cardinals ended up like if you're looking at defensive stats for the Steelers, were absolutely backwards because the Steelers are a team that give up yards and not points. The Cardinals only average 4.5 yards per play, 282 total yards. The Steelers, as bad as they were, outgained them 317 to 282. It reminded me, statistically, when the Cardinals gave up, 270-something yards to the Baltimore Ravens, and they still scored 31 points. This was one of those type of games because their offense, it really came down to the one drive. It was the 99-yard drive that was the difference maker because every other drive was hard. Every other drive was hard for them. And that 99-yard drive, being efficient on third down, getting the points right before the half was so impressive. But if you look at the numbers up, James Conner had a good game. Trey, McBride, we're going to talk about them in just a minute. Specifically, Kyler's passing numbers didn't look good. He only had 13 completions, and 11 of them went to tight ends. And so they had the receivers combined for 2 catches for 25 yards. Dortch had a 19-yarder. Rondale Moore had a 6-yarder. Now, granted, the touchdown throw would have made things look nicer if had O'Donnell not gotten called for the hold. You look on the defensive side of the ball, they didn't get any sacks. That's the second week in a row, no sacks. And so the pressure that they were, and analytically you talked about it. They're terrible at getting pressure, but they were good at getting sacks. They're not doing that even anymore. They did put their hands on 4 passes. Yeah, and they did hit the quarterbacks 5 times, but they are like the pressure that with the sack numbers they were doing without general pressure. Yeah, they didn't get pressure, and that's going to be tough. Like that's not sustainable, especially with the teams you got coming up on the schedule. Yeah, you're not going to be able to do that against the Eagles or the 49ers and find any sort of success. Now, maybe against the Bears and maybe against the Seahawks. Maybe by week 18. We'll see about that. But, they were great on third down, 10 of 17, which was uncharacteristic of this team. They held Pittsburgh to under 40% on third down, they just played pretty well. They played well enough in all three phases, which was really nice to see. The win didn't make any sense, just like the win over the Cowboys. So this is their 2 best games, like their 2 most dominant games, came against teams going into which would had top 5 defenses in the NFL this year. That makes absolutely no sense at all, does it?
No, it doesn't. But that's the NFL for you, man. I mean, there's a lot of games that just don't make a lot of sense, and we saw those unfold in front of us. But it's interesting because the one thing that I've kind of paid attention to is that the Cardinals, they're only averaging a little over 1 point more a game with Kyler back in the fold, and I think a lot of that just has to do with the fact that they just don't have a ton of talent on offense, but they're averaging 4 less points per game allowed, and even after the debacle of LA, that's really impressive. Yeah. And it kind of speaks to their ability, to control the game a little bit more.
When it comes down to, what it comes down to, it's protecting the football. The Cardinals released some of the facts, but this is the kind of the money stat. Kyler hasn't been, we're going to talk about Kyler, but say what you will about Kyler and how he's looked in the passing game. The Cardinals, they had lost 6 straight before Kyler came back. But in their previous 5 games before Kyler came back, they turned the ball over 10 times. Since Kyler's been back, in 4 games, they've only turned it over twice, and they're a +3 in those 4 games. If there's anything that you look at that, you can wonder. There's no reason. You can look at that and say that's the biggest reason why they are 2-2 since Kyler's return. Because Kyler, even though he's thrown 2 interceptions, and they were a little bit fortunate because they did have the 2 fumbles that they recovered of their own. I will say this. Why was that one fumble called a fumble when Kyler clearly tossed it forward.
Right.
I don't understand that. And did I miss something? Because when he was going down, he didn't just lose the ball. He said, okay, I'm going to flip this forward. That's an incomplete pass. Rondell Moore missed he dropped a handoff. And so there were a couple of times unfortunate. But they only have 2 turnovers in 4 games and they had 10 in the previous 5. Kyler's thrown 91 straight passes without an interception. And so, before last season, that was one thing that Kyler was really, really, really good at, was protecting the football. He gets a few passes knocked down, but his interception percentage is one of the lowest in team history. And so if anything else, and this would make sense, if you're not giving the ball away, you're not putting the defense in a bad position, which then makes it so that it's not going to be as easy for them to give up points. And so, they now are 2-2 since Kyler's returned. They're only averaging 1 put, but you look at it, they've got a 25-point game, they've got a 24-point game, and then they've got a couple of stinkers. But more importantly, they pop the top off the road stuff, and so you've got 4 games left, and we'll talk about that. But I love the direction. I love the direction, and we were worried after the Rams game because the game plans, kind of the decisions, like that looked like a team that was tanking. This was not a team that was tanking. This is a team that was being physical and out-physicaled a team that's known for being physical.
Right, and that's just what we had hoped and expected to see from this team. And you can see the vision, and you add a little bit more talent to some places, and you'll see the offense start to click a little more and the defense be able to control games. But right now they just haven't been able to do so and on a consistent basis. But twice this season they've been able to do it, and once this season they've made they were carried by Kyler to win a game. And so those things not too bad, right?
Yeah, it's not bad.
Not with the talent on the roster, at least.
Jeez, absolutely. Coming up next on the Rise of Sierra podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk. Let's move on and talk about the 2 stars. The 2 stars of the game, James Conner and Trey McBride. What did we love about that game? That's coming up next on Rise of Sierra. We're back on the Rise of Sierra podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the web. James Conner, 25 carries, 105 yards, 2 touchdowns, average 4.2 yards per carry. I think it makes it 11 straight games where he's had an average of 4 yards or more. He's averaging just under 5 yards a carry this season. He's got, I think, 1 fewer, he's second or third in the NFL in runs of 20 yards or more. So he's continuing what he was doing in terms of his effectiveness and his efficiency as a runner and his explosiveness the last 2 years. He got all the news and all the love in 2021 because of his touchdowns. Okay, that was all fantasy love. He's been a much better running back the last 2 seasons, and it shows. I think of James Conner as this. He's not an elite back. He's not a Derrick Henry. He's not a Nick Chubb. He's not those guys at the very top. Not a Jonathan Taylor, but he is just a little bit below them. He would get so much more love if he could stay healthy, because the impact he has on the Cardinals is nearly as impactful as you see the best backs in the NFL on their teams, right? And whether that's more of an indictment on the talent on the team, but the type of player that he is, he impacts that so much. And yeah, it's to see him do that, and they needed it. They needed everything. It was a grind-out performance until the final half of the final quarter, and then he took over that game.
Yeah, and it was a good second half performance, and like you said, the grinded out style, the way that he was able to push things. And you look at it, he's on pace to have the most yards in his Arizona Cardinals career. He has a chance to set the mark for the most yards in his career. I don't know if he'll get there. He needs 343 yards to break what was his career high of 973.
And against the 49ers and the Eagles, it's going to be hard
could
to
be,
run the ball that much.
Could be tough, but he has a chance. I mean, you look at it, 343 the last 3 games is not, or 4 games is not out of the question. And it'll be in, 3 less games because he only played 9. The crazy thing is, though, he's so much more efficient this year. 4.9 yards per carry, the most he's ever averaged in his career. His receiving stuff is way, way down this season.
There's a reason for that. They don't play him in receiving on passing downs.
Yeah, and I think it's helped him as a runner.
And that it's interesting because it just takes that one less thing. It's a very interesting way and very traditional, because it didn't feel like over the last few years is that they didn't have a third down. The Cardinals most certainly have a third down back. That's Amari DiMercato. He got hurt again, so Michael Carter filled that role. And guess what? Michael Carter he's really good in that role. If he gets a little more playing time in the system, I think he's going to be. And that's one of the more exciting things. That's for another show. That's one of the positives coming into this offseason, because you got Carter under contract for another year, which means you got Connor and Carter, and assuming that you like kind of what the running back room is, but Connor's just been it's hard to believe that a guy that doesn't have the volume numbers of a running back, and he's got a couple of Pro Bowls. He's certainly he's a great NFL player. He gets all sorts of love. He's super respected. But for a guy that does not have a 1,000-yard season in his career, he gets the respect from his teammates and from opponents and opposing coaches as if he were a premier back in the league. It's like he is just a hair. He's just below the premier backs in the league that could be. Like it's a case where you could see where this guy could bust off for 1,400 yards, but his body's it's just of all those things. That game against Cincinnati, he's having one of the best games of his Cardinals career. He's upended. He goes for leaping over a player, gets a little upended, and he has an injury, and he misses 4 weeks. That's just stupid. we should have had another month of James Conner.
Yeah, and he'd probably already be at his career high for yardage, right?
Yeah, probably. And here
with how efficient he's been.
And then you talk about Trey McBride. What happened? How did it happen that Trey McBride suddenly is one of the most promising young tight ends in the NFL?
I mean, I just think it's one of those situations where it takes tight ends a while. I think Kyle Pitts was the last rookie tight end to put up big numbers, but it typically takes tight ends a while. And I'm kind of going through right now the numbers.
Unless you're T.J. Hawkinson in your NFL debut against the Cardinals.
Right. But I mean, even Hawkinson that year didn't have.
That was a breakout game that he didn't break out the rest of the season.
Right. And it's interesting to look at, this season last season, McBride's number one. You look at this season, Sam Laporta is probably the best tight end we've seen in a long, long time. I mean, he's putting up numbers that are actually better than McBride's, but it's usually a season or two until a tight end comes to fruition. I mean, you look at Kyle Pitts, even like I said, that first year was such an anomaly. He was a Pro Bowler, over 1,000 yards, and he's got barely over 800 yards combined in his next 2 seasons. Right. And that's just kind of how the tight end position works for those guys. I mean, you look at the Steelers have a good tight end, right? Pat Freiermuth, he's a good ball player. he had 497 yards and 7 touchdowns. Now, to be fair, he's playing with Kenny Pickett, who's probably not good.
And in the Matt Canada offense until last week.
Yeah, and so like we have to take those things with a grain of salt, but he's been good. I mean, but McBride's breakout has been really fun to watch. And you look at McBride and Brown and Wilson, and none of their numbers are eye-popping by any means, but you look at what they have done separately, and you kind of look at what they could potentially do together if you were able to get like a big alpha out there with them. Yeah. And it would just really create a dynamic offensive set. And so you just look at that and you go, okay, let's see how that looks. But, you know, until everybody's healthy, until everybody until everybody can play at full speed, I think you're going to continue to see it be the Trey McBride show with a little Elijah Higgins and Jeff Swaim mixed in there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. He was a mess last year as a rookie. Even late in the year when he was filling in for Zach Ertz after he tore his ACL. Even there were flashes, and it feels like that the team finally found that they could trust him. They could trust him in the pass game. And you and I were talking this before the show. When he came out of college, I think everyone pegged him as being able to be a productive pass catcher in the league, right? Isn't that how it felt? That's what he did.
Yeah.
But the Cardinals, as a rookie, kept banging the drum that, you know, he wasn't so much a Zach Ertz as he was a Max Williams. And Max Williams, while he has receiving talent, was never a productive receiver, that he was more of a two-way. And in fairness, McBride is a willing blocker. He's just made mistakes over the first 2 years of his career. But it feels like as a rookie, they were, whether it was simply because they had Zach Ertz that they wanted to feature, that they were trying to put him in a role that didn't suit him. And now that Ertz got hurt and subsequently was released because McBride emerged and Ertz was like, hey, just, you know, if you're going to bench me, let me play for a good team. And then McBride is finally in that role, like, okay, you are our top tight end, so you are going to do some blocking, and we're going to target you in the passing game. And it's just been, you know, he already in 13 games, he has tied the franchise record, the single season record for receptions by a tight end with 56. So every catch that he makes between now and the end of the season over the final 4 games will set a new record. He has over 600 yards, which is there's only one. He's got 610 receiving yards. There's only been one tight end in franchise history that has had any season of more than what Trey McBride has, and that was Jackie Smith, who's in the Hall of Fame. He has 6 seasons that have more than McBride, but nobody else. He is number 7 with 1 through 6 ball being Jackie Smith. You know, over the last 4 games, you look at what he's done over the last few weeks, and you think 800 or 900 yards is, well, even if he gets 201 yards more between now and, so, you know, averaging 75, actually averaging just over 50 a game, he will have the second most receiving yards by a tight end in franchise history. The only one to do it better would be Jackie Smith's in 1967 when he had 1,200 yards, 1,205. And that was the year that Jackie Smith also caught the 56 passes. So McBride it's fun. You know, you remember all the tight ends, whether it was Rob Hausler or Troy Nicholas, I think, or Ricky Seals-Jones, or any number of the other, Dan Arnold. The Cardinals haven't had a good tight end. They had
Rob Hausler.
Freddie Jones was the closest thing, but he wasn't like a homegrown one. They signed him in free agency. They haven't had an impact tight end since Jay Novacek, and most of y'all probably aren't old enough to remember who Jay Novacek is. I don't think Seth's old enough to remember Jay Novacek.
I mean, I remember him for the Cowboys.
Yeah. He started with the Cardinals, and he was pretty good for the Cardinals, and yeah. So it appears, knock on wood, that he stays healthy. I think the Cardinals have just found their tight end. Whether I'm not gonna say that he's gonna be a premier tight end in this league, but like they found their guy. Like he is to the Cardinals in terms of role and like he's being here. He's the George Kittle. Greg Kittle's baseball from the 80s. Sorry, guys.
Greg Olson.
Greg Olson, Travis Kelce, those guys. And I'm not saying he's going to reach that level, or Zach Ertz when he was with the Eagles. He's not even necessarily at the reach, but you know who the Cardinals tight end is, and he's a legitimate receiving threat.
Yeah, and you look at it, I was just going back. He's on pace for a similar second season to what Hawkinson had, right? Like that's a huge deal. I don't think people realize that. Hawk had, you joked about it, 6 catches for 131 yards against the Cardinals in the first game of the season, and he finished with 32 receptions for 367 yards on the season. So that's not taking out the Cardinals game. That's just what he had for the rest of the season. But his second season, 67 for 723 and 6 touchdowns. Outside of the touchdowns, maybe McBride should surpass all of those, right? So you're looking at it, you're talking about one of the gold standards of tight ends in the NFL. He's on pace to do something similar to that. Now, I think expecting him to ever be in the realm of a guy like a Travis Kelce or that ilk might be too high, and he probably won't even have a season because it just doesn't happen very often, like a Mark Andrews had in 2021, where he had almost 1,400 yards and 10 touchdowns. But like if he's consistently in the 700 to 900 yard
that's fantastic,
and 8 to 10 touchdowns, you're talking about a premier tight end that you're going to be able to also pay. And that's the thing that we always talk about, right? Like, can these guys get to a second contract? And obviously it's super early. It's just season 2, but I mean, he's on pace for that. And you go back and like I said, 2018, you have Mark Andrews and Dallas Goedert. He's on pace for similar to that, like those two guys. 2019, you've got Hawkinson. I already, laid that out. He's ahead of even like a Noah Fant, who was a first round pick, right? Like he's ahead of what Fant was doing in Denver. Now, again, you can look at the team and kind of judge on that, but and he's ahead of Cole Kmet, who was the top tight end in 2020. 2021, you've got a really bad class or a guy that hasn't worked out as well as you'd hope in Kyle Pitts. And then 22, McBride's, kind of headlining the tight end crew. And there's not a bad group there with Cade Otton and Jake Ferguson playing well, but McBride's number 1 on that list right now in terms of yardage. And so you look at it, yeah, okay, maybe he doesn't end up being, Travis Kelce or doesn't get to the heights of a George Kittle. But if you're talking about a guy that can have a similar, and maybe he doesn't get as big as what, the best years of a guy like TJ Hawkinson or Mark Andrews, but he's in that conversation year in and year out. I think you've got to be super excited about what he provides and what he'll be as a player.
Jason Witten.
Yeah.
I like that.
Now, maybe not for the length of time.
Right. And Witten even had 4,000-yard seasons, but he had 1, 2, like if we're taking the 1,000 CR seasons, he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 seasons where he had 7 in the 700 to 900 range.
And that's what you're looking for. I mean, that if that's what you get from a guy, you are 100% like, that's a huge win. Like, that's, if he doesn't reach the apex of, being a all pro, there's nothing wrong with that. But if he's a Pro Bowl level tight end, like, that's a huge,
sometimes
huge
Pro
win.
Bowler would be ideal. Like,
right. Right.
Because, with some of the tight ends that there are in the NFL, it's hard to crack that. But if he can be a sometimes Pro Bowler, you've got, like, how many tight ends the Cardinals have had in the Pro Bowl?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Not a single one in my lifetime.
Right. And that's just what it is, man. I mean, you just look at it. They've got some opportunities. They have some pieces that you have to be excited about.
Yeah.
And that's just the big thing. You just hope that they're able, with what Monty Ossenfort did in his first season as the GM, you're hopeful that it's going to continue on the upward trend.
Coming up next on the Rise Up Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web, let's talk a little bit about Kyler Murray's play specifically, even though it was not a statistically good game. That's coming up next on Rise Up Red. We're back on the Rise Up Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. Kyler Murray and his play. Statistically, if you looked at the line, you're like, eh. And honestly, if you look at his 4 games, there's not a game that you're super impressed with. He completed 13 of 23 passes, not particularly good on the completion percentage, 145 yards, a touchdown, no turnovers. He had 9 carries for 20 yards, granted 3 of those. So if you take away the kneel downs, he had 6 carries for 23 yards. He didn't have a rushing touchdown, passer rating just a tick under 90 at 89.9, so nothing special. I will say this. I saw in that game, so Houston, so I loved what he did against Atlanta. I loved it. I thought that was full Kyler on display. In Houston, he had some bad throws, as in what happened with that throw. Against the Rams, it was not what happens, like, why are you throwing that ball? We questioned his decision making. He looked not good last week. Against the Steelers, I know that it was a little bit off at the beginning, but you look at the overall performance, ignore the statistics. If you watch what you saw on the field, what you saw was a quarterback that was making plays. I didn't see bad throws, and I didn't see bad decision throws either. And so he kind of put it all together, and he was partially a victim of circumstance. Rondell drops the one. I'm some like, yes, that's a play you should make. Absolutely, it hit him right in the hands. At the same time, that still is a tough play to make, because he did get his feet tangled up and he was falling to the ground when it happened. Should a second round receiver make that catch? Yes. They had the deep throw to Rondell, which should have been a touchdown, nullified. And so you put those two, or even one of those two completions back on the books with the yards, you have a much more impressive game in the passing game. I was thoroughly impressed with the way Kyler played. I thought that he made good decisions with his throws. He threw some absolute dots down the field, and even though his numbers were bad, I was really happy with the way Kyler played in tough circumstances, because he's not one who likes to play in adverse conditions when it comes to, like, wet and rain and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I thought this was one of the, this is a grinded out game, and you get those, as things go. And that's what's always interesting to me, is how people respond to these things, because you look at it, right, and it's like you go through the wins and the losses and things like that, and you say, would you rather have a game, we went back a couple weeks and going back and you say, hey, would you rather have him go 13 for 27 for 199 yards, 2 touchdowns and an interception in a win, or would you rather him go, 20, 26 for 36 for 304 yards and 2 touchdowns and a loss? And people will be like, well, obviously the win. It's like, then why do you criticize how the win got there? Because at the end of the day, it is about the wins. Now, we talked about the Rams game, and a lot of that was on his shoulders. A lot of that was, he wasn't making the plays that he needed to make. And so, like, if you're going to grind that, then you have to look at what he was able to do this week and say, hey, this was a good game. It wasn't pretty by any means.
And then you look at some of that's like, we've seen some underwhelming games and that had like, the yards per attempt in the low fours. This was a very respectable 6.3 yards per attempt. That's nothing good, but it wasn't bad. And so his passing numbers were not inefficient. His completion percentage was lower than its average, but he took care of the ball. He had a couple of drops. And this is considering, again, 11 of his 13 pass completions went to tight ends.
Right. And I think a lot of that,
you're not going to get good production in the pass game if your wide receivers only catch 2 passes.
Right. And I think a lot of that is he just doesn't trust the wide receivers right now.
Nope. Good reason why. Good reason why.
Right.
Good reason why. But I really liked the performance. I wish, in the 5 years we've watched Kyler Murray, we keep expecting to see a version of Kyler that's like the 5,000-yard combined passing and rushing. We haven't quite gotten that because he has a lot of games that he impacts in other ways without being super productive as a passer, as a volume passer. And I wish he would do volume passing numbers as well, because then it would kind of close the mouths of the people who look at him and say he's not a good quarterback. I'm like, how can you look at him and think he's not a good quarterback? Because we've seen bad quarterback play. We've seen bad quarterback play this year where the player's best isn't even this good.
Right. And that's just what you have to look at. And, it's always interesting to me because that's kind of how things go, right? You have people want all of it. They want the high level of statistics. They want
the Patrick Mahomes passing numbers with the Lamar Jackson rushing numbers.
Right. And but they also want the wins. And then you look at it and the biggest one was the 2 weeks that, Josh Dobbs went and had, good games for the Minnesota Vikings and won games. And, and all of a sudden it's like, well, look, what were they thinking? And then now
he throws 4 interceptions.
Right. Well, and then they lose 2 games in a row. He throws 2 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. And they're like, hey, we're probably going to go with this guy at quarterback and not Dobbs, who we just traded for because he's that bad. And that's just, it's just the ebbs and flows of the game. But a lot of times a guy is who he shows you, and they can have positive games. But I think that it's the steadiness of what we've seen that I think you have to appreciate Kyler. And, yes, you would love to see a little bit more. But again, it's been 7 weeks total in the system, and he's got this team at 2-2 in that time.
Yeah.
Like, that's at the end of the day, that's what it is. And if he's the thing that's holding you back from being really good, that I have no problem with looking at it and going, hey, they need to move on. But at the same time, he's doubled your win total in half the amount of games. Like, so to say that, because remember, every week we were jokingly saying, oh, well, this will be a get right game for this team. And now it's like, oh, well, apparently with Kyler, it's not a guaranteed get right, because he can keep this team in a game and make plays.
Yeah, it's good to see. I desperately want him to have a big passing game. We haven't seen because
Well, you and I
want.
mean,
It's not going to happen against the 49ers.
Right. I was going to say that's the biggest thing is you're going to have to wait another week or 2 weeks technically.
Yeah. So you've got San Francisco, you've got Chicago, then you've got Philadelphia, and then you've got the Eagles. I'm sorry. Then you've got the Seahawks to end the season. But that's a topic for another show. Coming in next on the Rest of Seared podcast, the best of our Cardinals talk on the web. We're back to this. Should the Cardinals be winning games? Was that win good for them? That's coming up next on Rise of Seared. We're back on the Rise of Seared podcast, best of Cardinals talk on the web. The Cardinals improved to 3-10 on the season. They now are number 3 in the NFL draft order. I have been on the record with you try to win. You don't actively tank, and I know that there's some. I think it's more when you need a quarterback, but obviously draft status matters. Is the loss like how many wins is too many wins, do you think?
Well, so I was going through it, and I was going to get your opinion on this. The worst thing that can happen is that the Cardinals finish with 4 wins. And what I mean by that is I don't actually think that's a bad thing because, like you said, winning games, and if you go 3-5 with Kyler Murray with this team, you look at it and you go, hey, that's not bad. But that could end up putting you at the 8th pick in the draft. Now, I haven't gone through every team's schedule. So just everybody understand that caveat because I don't know if these teams still play each other.
Because Carolina's terrible, and the Patriots are terrible.
I think they're tanking.
It must be.
I feel like Belichick is that good that he's like, hey, look, we've given up. I mean, did you see that crazy statistic? Like they gave up a stupid low number of points and they won 0 games in November.
They lost 6-0.
Right. And it's like, is this guy doing this on purpose? Because he's crazy enough to do it on purpose, if we're being completely honest. But so you look at who's below them. Washington. I don't know if Washington's winning another game. Chicago, obviously, that's a big head-to-head between the Cardinals and Bears. The Jets, the Giants, and the Titans. Don't know if any of those teams are winning a game. If the Cardinals beat the Bears, and again, I have not fact-checked this, so take this for what it's worth. If the Cardinals beat the Bears and all those teams lose out, which is 100% possible unless they somehow play each other, and
the Cardinals' strength of schedule is way too good.
They're going to pick 8th. So beating the Bears literally could mean the difference between the Cardinals picking 3rd and 8th.
And I know when we're all talking about Marvin Harrison Jr., that's tough because I think there are so many fans that are dead set on Harrison, and he's
now here's what I'll say about that. And I agree. I think he's the cat's meow. I think he's the best player in the draft, hands down. Better than Caleb Williams, better than Drake May. I think he's the best player in the draft. He's the closest thing to Megatron that we've seen coming out of college in forever. Like he is a phenom. The nice thing about it is there's 2 other guys in Malik Neighbors and Keon Coleman that are very good football players. Now, they may not be Marvin Harrison Jr. level, but Neighbors and Coleman are both alpha receivers, bigger guys that fit exactly what the Cardinals need, opposite of what they have even if they decide to retain Hollywood Brown. They're big X receivers that can get open, that have some juice or have a lot of juice and make plays with the ball in their hands. Obviously, Marvin Harrison and Keon Coleman are different size than Malik Neighbors, but Neighbors is more than adequate size wise. He's built like Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, and not saying he will be of that level of play, but he's 6 foot, 205 pounds. He's plenty big. The difference is you have Marvin Harrison Jr., who's I think 6'3", and Keon Coleman, who's 6'4", and then they're also, incredible talents.
Well, it's Harrison. Well, you've got the size, you got the athleticism, and then you've got the bloodlines because my goodness.
Right. And so I don't,
I don't know how many of you who listen remember seeing Marvin Harrison, and I think he's a different mentality, but Marvin Harrison was also one of the scariest dudes on the football field.
Yeah. And so you just look at it, it's, it will stink to see that happen,
but
that
drop
happen. But
if they want him badly enough, they have a second first-round pick in that round.
Right. They can 100%. Like if they think, which he is that much of a game changer, then you can go get him. But I don't think the drop. Now, again, I'm not taking away anything from Harrison. I truly do think he is the best player in this draft. But I think in most drafts, Malik Neighbors and Keon Coleman are legitimate top 10 picks. So it just happens that it's the year that there's a true freak or a true generational talent, if you will. But Coleman could be a Mike Evans type of player. And Neighbors could be a guy like a Justin Jefferson level. And so those things, I think have to weigh in on that, where you're saying like, yeah, everybody would love to get Marvin Harrison Jr., but is Marvin Harrison Jr. worth losing that, 18th pick where you could get a right tackle or an edge rusher or an interior defensive lineman? Again, best player in the draft by far, but I don't know if I would do that. So that's where I would be if you're dead set on receiver. And we haven't even talked about some other guys like Rome Odunze, who's a freak of nature out of Washington. And then the kid out of Texas, Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Worthy. And then the kid out of South Carolina is a freaking bully. Xavier Leggett. Like he's the type of guy this team needs. He's more of the Anquan Bolden type, but I don't think anybody would complain about that, right?
No, and the guys, this is why you should be listening to Seth's podcast, because that's how you'll know about these guys. Listen to Seth's podcast.
And hopefully Justin's been having some he's in law school right now, so it's been a long last couple of weeks for him while he's getting through finals. So hopefully we'll be picking back up here shortly.
And there's time. There's lots of time before the draft.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think you would agree with me. You just look at it and you obviously the ideal thing is you get the best player in the draft. Every year that's your goal. But I thought Will Anderson was the best player in this last draft, and I was fine with the trade down.
Yeah.
Would Will Anderson improve this defense? 1,000%.
Especially right now, because he's now producing, and it's that time of the year, and he's getting to the quarterback, and this is the time the Cardinals are not getting to the quarterback at all.
Right. And so you look at it, obviously you'd love to have a player of that ilk right now, but at the end of the day, like Paris Johnson Jr. looks like he's going to be a very good right tackle or offensive lineman in this league. And you've got guys that you can surround him with. And now you've got 2 picks in a draft. So maybe you don't get a level of Will Anderson, but you end up getting a guy, like a Jared Verse, like a Chop Robinson, if you go that route, or a Braylon Trice or a JT Tuamolo. Like there are definitely upside and options available, and that is what excites you. Yeah, it may not be the best player in the draft like you could have had if you would have went 3 and 14, but I don't think anybody's going to lament going 3 and 5 with your starting quarterback after going 1 and 8. And what was their actual record? 1 and 13 without him the last 2 seasons.
Yeah.
So I mean, again, to Jess's point, you need to win games because at the end of the day, that is important. And that's what this franchise needs. And it's becoming more and more apparent that Kyler will be the guy in 2024. We've spelled out the reasons on this podcast enough times. You don't need us to do it again, but he'll be the guy in 2024. And you want that feeling that they are going in the right direction with everybody involved. And I think that would be a big, big thing.
And with that, we will end this edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, episode 493, our bye-week edition. We will come back next week after take more. The Cardinals got the week off. We're going to take the rest of the week off ourselves. We'll be back recording Tuesday night next week. We won't have a game to talk about, but we'll have stuff to talk about for sure. That's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. See you guys again next week. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up C-Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise Up Red C, Be Red C-Red, and of course, Rise Up C-Red.
Roll!